Hello, and welcome to the Spring 2021 Airy KVEC Fire Summit. My name is Tami Estep, and my project was entitled Do the Math. I know you're as excited as I am to get started, so let's go ahead. Just a little bit about myself in case you weren't able to make the Fall Fire Summit. I attended Pikeville College where I received my bachelor's degree, and I earned my master's degree at Morehead State University. I've been an educator for 20 years where I have taught elementary school age children all the way to college level classes. I've had the opportunity to work with special needs students, home hospital students, and students who needed specialized math interventions. I had the privilege to be a part of the Kentucky Center for Math by attending trainings and have received certifications through grant funding as a numeracy specialist, AVMR specialist, teacher leader, and math recovery intervention specialist. Last year, I was afforded the opportunity with my district to become a Google certified level 1 educator. Let me tell you, teaching through a pandemic virtually, this opportunity has definitely paid off. Currently, I'm an educator with Jenkins Independent Schools, where I'm the director of the Jenkins Middle High School Math Academy. Now, let's fast forward 8 months to the present. Teacher necessities have definitely changed as we have been teaching during a pandemic. Although we put Germex on our special class request lists, Germex is now a complete necessity in every classroom. And who can forget our daily temperature checks? And we can't forget to wear our masks. So the question we're facing is, how do we as educators meet the needs of our students through distance learning during a pandemic? Well, guess what? I'm going to show you. As the design of the Jenkins Middle High School Math Academy began, there were several purposes behind this endeavor. The purpose that started it was to meet the ever-growing need of grade level deficits in mathematics due to the effects of COVID-19. If we think back to a year ago, back in March 2020, when all of this began, teaching virtually and students learning virtually at home, and maybe not even learning virtually, just being aided with packets to finish and turn back into school. Needless to say, our students did fall behind, but not from lack of effort on our teachers or on our students and their families. We were in a new situation, but we were able to overcome it. We want to allow students to work at their own pace as they need and also progress as fast as they can in the math lab. We want to offer lab classes to increase the mastery of mathematics topics, concepts, and skills that our students need, not just in class, but as they leave our school and go out into their career or technical field that they choose. We also want to offer lab classes to bridge the gap of low-performing mathematics students so that they can see success. And we want to allow our students to get individualized, differentiated math instruction. Lab classes are also allowing our students to learn with manipulatives and research-based strategies. Let's face it, if it's not been proven to be effective, we don't want to waste our time with it. Now, our long-term goal for our Math Academy and Math Lab classes is to continue these lab classes to meet the need of low-performing students who continue to need math interventions. We also want to offer advanced mathematic courses to the students who are proficient in grade level content math classes. As students progress and are becoming successful and they see their success and become confident, we want them to continue in their learning. We want them to continue to grow. We want to be able to offer them the choices to take higher level mathematics courses to prepare them, whether they choose a technical school or college as their career path. So here's our problem. Can struggling students overcome grade level deficits through virtual learning during a pandemic? Well, with math, data, and student work, I'm going to show you that students can be successful with virtual learning even in a pandemic. This was the data that I have been collecting and analyzing throughout the year. I collected all the students' math data. I collected student work samples and then teacher observations from the data. So let's take a look at the math data. Let's take a look at the MAP data. Students that participated in math lab classes showed a growth of 87.3%, showed a growth of 87.3% from their fall MAP test of 2020 and then the winter test of 2021. We had 11.8% students who did decrease, but even with those who decreased, they only decreased at 3 points or less. And then we had 9% of our students show no growth at all. They stayed the same. This pie chart reflects MAP data that was collected based on students who were actively engaged in their virtual learning. That means they were attending Google Meet sessions, they were logging in for class, they were actively participating and turning in their assignments. Those students showed a growth of 99% based on the fall MAP scores and their winter MAP scores. Students who were actively engaged showed no decrease and only 1% showed no growth. They stayed consistent. They had the same score in the fall and the same score in the winter. Let's take a look at some of the student work samples. This is a clip from a PowerPoint that a student created. One of our first lessons when students began back in August was we tackled decimals and place value. And a lot of students really struggled with this concept because they had no visual representation. Students didn't have a visual representation. Also, one of the deficits that I have noticed students have had to encounter with any unit is the vocabulary. Once the vocabulary had been introduced and students began using manipulatives and working with decimals, at the end of the unit, they were asked to take the unit vocabulary and create a PowerPoint to show their understanding of the terms that were used. Throughout that unit, once students were able to understand and familiarize themselves and visualize what decimals were, students began working with adding, subtracting, and multiplying decimals. And a lot of students, their major obstacle was just the fact of aligning the decimal and the correct place values. And as you can see here, this student was able to correctly add, subtract, and multiply decimals once she realized how to line up the decimal and how to use the decimal values. Here's a student that at the beginning of the year, he wasn't confident in math. He knew he struggled, and it was very frustrating for him. And a lot of his assignments looked like this. He would start and he would scribble everything out and he would start over. And of course, that became very frustrating. Once he mastered structuring and understanding decimals and understanding place value, you can see on this activity towards the end of the unit, he became proficient at converting fractions, decimals, and percentages. He's also one of the students that was successful on his map testing in the winter and had a growth of 22 points. Here's an example of some student work that dealt with our unit over inequalities. We also not only have been learning the concepts and the skills needed to be successful in math, but we also have been working on explaining our procedures. And this was a student at the beginning of the year that, when asked to explain his assignment, he had no sentence structure, and it was very difficult for him to explain because, as well, he had gaps in his mathematics learning. Once those gaps were filled, he was able to progress at his own rate. Here's an example of students using the distributive property and factoring using the distributive property. This is another student who had double digits in growth on her map assessment. And just this week, this student has been beginning to understand linear equations and how a table of solutions is made and how to find the points that will be needed to plot them on a coordinate plane. This student had a growth of 18 points from his fall map to his winter map assessment and had a score that was at grade level. Here's another example of an exit slip that was assigned at the end of the lesson, where we were making table of solutions for linear equations and learning to recognize positive and negatives within the equation. Let's look at some teacher observations that were made as I collected data throughout the year. This is student 1. This is a collection of scores of their formative and summative assessments. As you can see, at the beginning of the year, where there was several gaps in their learning, their scores were not proficient and they weren't even consistent. They have very low scores, and even though they do make a gain, they drop right back down. As the gaps were beginning to be filled and they were learning concepts and skills that they didn't have, you can see that their scores on formative and summative assessments begin to increase and even begin to start staying at a proficient rate. This is data taken from student 2. These are scores of her formative and summative assessments. As you can see too, she was very low on her assignments at the beginning of the year. Again, she's got highs and lows, but there's no consistency because of the gaps that she had. As you can see here towards March, she not only begins to stay proficient, but she is consistent in her scores. This student gained 40 points between her fall map data and her winter map data. Student 3 is a student who had some minor gaps. She did show growth. She grew 6 points on her map data. But as you can see too, at the beginning of the year, you can see where her gaps were at by the lows and the highs. Again, by March, you can see all of her work is proficient, and towards the end of winter, she begins to progress at a proficient rate. And from here, most of her scores are within the 90% to 100% range. One thing too that helped me with the data of formative and summative assessments, I did notice at this point right here, this score is reflective of a vocabulary assignment at the beginning of a unit. And again, vocabulary has been a big part in our math lab classes. Every unit begins with understanding the vocabulary that's going to be used throughout that unit. And that is one thing that I have noticed has made an impact on our students, is that once they understand the terms and they understand what they're being asked to solve, that they are becoming more successful. Here is a graph that shows student 4 progress throughout the year. This student had a growth of 39 points on his fall map to his winter map assessment. Again, he started out with a proficient score, but you can see he's not consistent. He had a lot of gaps that needed to be filled in. With those gaps, once they were filled in, he maintains proficiency and even mastery at 100% on several assignments. Again, he takes a dip right here on this assignment, and again, it was a vocabulary assignment at the beginning of at the unit. One of the things that's always effective as an educator is communication. But as we have taught during a pandemic and with virtual learning, communication is more crucial than ever, whether it's for the student or whether it's for the family, whether it's a parent, a grandparent, an aunt and uncle. Communication has been key. And I know I'm probably, as they say, preaching to the choir. We all know this. But whatever form it has been, communication has really hit home. One way I communicated with my students is giving them a scoring guide so that they knew what my expectations were. One of the assignments, one of the tools that was embedded into our math lab was a program called CK12. If you're not familiar with CK12, it is an online program that gives students a lesson with interactive activities to teach with. After completing the lesson, students are given what is called a daily adaptive practice assignment. Based on how they score, the intensity of the questions either increase or decrease, and it puts the learning into the students' hands. We allow them to retake an assessment over if they need to. After, of course, there is some remediation involved. Here's just an example of a CK12 lesson. It gives some vocabulary at the very beginning. Again, there are interactive activities that you can teach within your video to help the students, along with assigning those interactive activities for them to complete. Once they complete them at a mastery level, then they take, again, what is called the adaptive practice, and they are given questions based on the vocabulary and the skills that they practice. At the end of their adaptive practice, they are then told information based on their answers. This information is sent to the teacher as well. So therefore, you can see what they struggled with and where they need remediation still. It tells them how many they got correct. It lets them know how many that they were continually getting correct in a row. It tells them how long they spent. And then, of course, this was the skill level indicator. Depending on what color they fell in, told them what grade that they received on that assignment. This also, in case maybe their internet went out or maybe they were taking a break, this right here also let them know how much of the adaptive practice was completed. Obviously, as any teacher does, we put comments on our students' work. We let them know how they did. Here is just an example of some communication with a student on an assignment using the distributive property, letting him know his score, letting him know that I was proud of his progress, and pointing out something positive on his assignment. I'm going to move my little window down here for just a second. Here is another example of some student work. This was the beginning of algebraic expressions and understanding the vocabulary that we had gone over. This student missed a couple. She was allowed to redo the assignment with some remediation. And we worked together one-on-one. And after collaborating back and forth, she didn't she did redo the assessment and received 100%. Again, one thing to point out within our Google Classroom, we had the advantage of messaging back and forth. Students were able to send me messages when they were stuck on a problem, and I immediately would respond and either walk them through that, or whether they needed to call me or do a Google Meet. It really opened that door of communication because I had my email set with it. So I had a notification in my email as soon as a student sent a message to me. Again, just some communication with a student throughout the day. He was having problems finding the assignment. And in this case, we did have a statewide issue on this day. But like I said, it just, again, throughout the day, he was communicating with me, and I was communicating not only with him, but with mom on the phone. I called to check and see how things were going and try to do some troubleshooting on their end. But again, we know communication is vital as an educator. Here's a student who struggled at the beginning. He started to make some gains and he was having a bad day. He asked if he could redo the questions. His mom contacted me. We did some remediation work, and then he successfully completed the assignment. Here was a student, again, communication is key. He was really great at communication. Several times a week, he was either emailing me, calling in. He even came in for tutoring. He knew when he needed help, and he wasn't afraid to ask for it. Again, not only communicating with our students, but communicating with our parents. Here was a student who was having problems opening an assignment. Their internet had gone out, but of course, mom had phone signal. So mom reached out to me with an email. I called her, find out what was going on. He was wanting to get the assessment. He was really nervous because he couldn't get online, and just reassured him that everything would be okay, and sent the assessment to mom. He did his work, sent me his work with the Rocketbook app, and he did very well. Another solution for teaching in a pandemic is using research-based strategies. The strategies that I use within our math lab are strategies that I was taught that were proven to be effective through the U.S. Math Recovery Council. Also, the strategies that I use are based on trainings from the Kentucky Center for Mathematics. Another key that we all know is differentiated instruction. Students who had IEPs, modifications were met. And also within the math lab, the great thing about this is that students get their lessons designed based on their needs. Remember, the purpose is bridging that gap, helping them to overcome their deficits so that they can be successful. And with that success comes confidence. Just like I tell my students, they may never love math, but they're going to be confident that they can be successful in math. Technical resources. This is where our grant providers have played such an important role. And I'm sorry for moving my video, but just want again to express how thankful I am that our students were able to receive the technological resources and the manipulatives based on this grant. The wireless headphones allowed me to communicate with my students. Behind me right here, this was the drawing tablet that was so effective, especially on our Google Meets, and teaching students, letting them see what math really looks like so that they could visualize it. And this was the Rocketbook that was used with the Rocketbook app. It's almost like an interactive whiteboard. You cannot tell that this has even been used. The purpose behind it is that you write on it. It's specially designed paper. It also has lined paper, blank paper. It's got a calendar, different resources that can be used. But the special thing about it is that with this special cloth and just a little bit of water that you squirt on the page, it wipes off as long as you use the pens that are designated for Rocketbook. But again, a wonderful tool that has helped our students work in math lab and communicate. Again, another solution to the problem is math manipulatives. Again, a huge thank you. So appreciative from myself and my students. This is our first year that we have had the Math Academy and offered math lab classes. So it is a new endeavor here in Jenkins, which means that we didn't have much to start with, but through this grant, manipulatives were purchased that students were able to use. Here's a student using place value. Here is a student using place value manipulatives and understanding and visualizing the place value system and decimals. This student here used fraction tiles to make equivalent fractions so that they could see them and understand why 1/2 and 3/6 are equivalent. And here are some of the geometry manipulatives. In this activity, students use their manipulatives to compare the shapes to understand their similarities and their differences. Again, communication is key, but even more so as we tackled virtual learning this year to keep those lines of communication open. I had a teacher webpage. Again, I use the Rocketbook app and the Rocketbook materials to communicate back and forth with my students and for them to communicate back and forth with me. The drawing tablet helps students to visually see the representations that are used in mathematics. And again, the wireless headphones allowed me to teach and move freely as I taught virtually. We did encounter some other problems. We did have students that were without a device or an internet connection. If they did not have a device, our school district provided all students with a Chromebook. For students who did not have an internet connection, students would receive a weekly jump drive. The teachers would load all their work onto a jump drive for them to complete at home on a school-supported Chromebook. Then they would bring the jump drive back to the school when their work was completed and receive the next week's work. Students were also given the opportunity to make appointments to come into the school when it was safe. When numbers were drastically high, however, students used Google Meets, of course, to communicate and set up appointments for one-on-one intervention meetings. It was very minimal, but we even had some students who requested a paper packet. And for those that needed that modification, those students were granted those packets as well. So the results. You've seen that students can overcome grade level deficits during virtual learning during a pandemic with communication, research-based strategies, differentiated instruction, technological resources, and math manipulatives. Thank you again for taking the time to view the video. If you have any questions or even some ideas, feel free to contact me at my email, my school number, and visit my teacher webpage. And again, a huge thank you to Ari, KVEC, and all the grant donors. We here at Jenkins Math Lab are very much appreciative of all that you have done to support us this year. Thank you for viewing. Stay safe and have a great day.